on today's Story Beat.
Someone once gave me this advice, and they said, if you're a writer, you write. Now, what that means is that you don't write because you have this ideal that you're going to write the great American novel. Just go ahead and write because you like to write. Because chances are, you're not going to write the great American novel. You'll be lucky to get a book published. If it gets published, you'll be lucky if 10 people read it. So make sure that you know what you're doing and you're getting into writing for the right reasons, and that is because you enjoy writing.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, the novelist John David Bethel, is appearing for the second time on StoryBeat. David's the author of award-winning political and psychological thrillers, including Mapping the Night and Holding Back the Dark. His short fiction has been published in popular consumer magazines, and his essays and opinion editorials have been published in respected political journals. David spent 35 years in politics and government. He served in the Federal Senior Executive Service as Senior Advisor, Director of Speechwriting for the Secretaries of Transportation, Commerce, and Education, Editorial Director for the U.S. Small Business Administration, and Assistant Administrator for the U.S. General Services Administration's Office of Communications and Citizen Services. David also worked as a press secretary, speechwriter to members of Congress. During the first conversation that we had, we discussed Mapping the Night. Recently, I read two of David's newest books, Squinting at Shadows and Thy Brother's Keeper, both of which are in the thriller mold of David's earlier novels. They are intense, page-turning mysteries that kept me wondering what would happen next. If you like reading thrillers, I highly urge you to check out David's books. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a terrific pleasure for me to welcome back to StoryBeat the excellent writer, John David Bethel. David, thanks so much for joining me again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure to see you again. So let's go and chat about back in time a little bit, something we didn't talk about last time. I know you had to have been a reader as a boy. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's what got me into writing. As a matter of fact, my dad was in the Foreign Service. And we spent most of my life, my early life, first 13 years, as a matter of fact, overseas. I didn't live in the United States for those first 13 years. And during that time, I went to like 8 different schools. We were out of these, I missed large swaths of education. And the way I filled in was my parents would give me books to read and anything else they could get their hands on. And that's what got me into it. I got excited about reading and writing.
Were you reading mysteries and thrillers back in that time?
No, not really. I was reading mostly. My dad was a big fan of Ernest Hemingway.
Well, we talked about Ernest Hemingway on the last show and that you met him down in Cuba. We talked about that, which I find fascinating. But so when did you start to get interested in thrillers and mysteries?
Well, that happened while I was writing a book. I was collaborating with a private investigator who was involved in a very strange case in Miami. And he had read one of my books. He called me up. He said, look, I've got an interesting case here. I want you to write about it. It was about a man he was kidnapped by a group of thugs, and he was a multimillionaire, had a lot of business interests. Was kept in a warehouse for 30 days. And this was before, all these gadgets that we have now. He actually had to write checks out and things like that and give them the deed to his house. And awful story. And they almost killed him. He got away by some fluke of fate, and he called my friend, who turned out to be my friend, the private investigator, and he got me involved in writing about that. And while he was doing that, he gave me a whole pile of files. In that file was one on the Key West serial killer, who he was working with the Key West police force to try and fine. And that's how I got into it. I read this file combined with the thing he was currently involved in, and that file. And reading that file, I got fascinated by the whole mindset of these people.
Interesting. So, do you read other mystery writers now?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, I do. I read lots of stuff. I read lots of different stuff. In that stuff, yes, I will read. I can't give you the names of the authors now so much because I just read so much and then I throw the book away. But yes, short answer to your question is yes, I do occasionally.
Well, I guess what I'm leading to is, where did you learn to write mysteries, which are a specific genre? Obviously, it didn't come from voluminous reading of mystery writers. Where did it come from?
I guess I just have an ability to think in the way that thriller writers do. I didn't know I had that ability. I was writing mostly political thrillers, which is a totally different genre than the psychological thriller.
I have to assume, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that your many years in Washington, where there's always a sense of intrigue going on behind the scenes, that had to have fed into it somewhat.
Probably. I mean, I can remember being, on the Hill or working in these offices and doing the what if, if I had this situation, what if someone was corrupt? Where would it go? I'm playing it over in my mind. My very first book that I wrote was very much of that. It was a senator's wife was killed, and I always wondered, well, what happened? Who takes over if this was something like this would happen? Would it be the FBI? Would it be the Capitol Hill Police? How would they go about it? And from my imagination, I just developed this whole story.
So, as a writer of many different things in Washington for many years, did you have a sense as you were working in wherever you were assigned? Did you have a sense that you were trying to figure out what was going on, like a detective might?
Obviously, when you write a novel, there's a lot of drama that you add to situations that just isn't there in real life, at least not as overtly. Subtly in the background, very subtly, you can say, well, if you just turn the focus just a little bit this way and your perspective a little bit that way, you can find all of these conspiratorial possibilities. But yes and no. I mean, at the time when I'm sitting down working in the office, grinding it out, 8 hours a day, I'm not thinking that. But in the background, I am sure that I stored up a lot of this. What if this happened and what if that happened, which then was regurgitated as some of my novels.
Well, in the 3 books of yours that I've read, there's a lot of politics in them. That's something that's part of and parcel, I guess, of what we would call your thematic work, is that there's politics involved.
Yeah, they say write what you know, and I guess this proves that that's the case. But it's difficult for me to not see politics, as you just said, since I spent so many years in politics, to not see politics as a possibility in everything that I write. I can start writing about something totally, removed from politics, and my mind goes there.
So I'm going to dig in a little deeper. It's interesting to me. You could, if you chose to, which obviously you have not, you could have been a historian. You could have written about political figures and about their lives. You didn't. You chose to fictionalize stories and tell stories like that, as well as doing it in a mystery that involves politics in some way. But your stories are not about politics. And so I'm curious, what is it about the mystery and the thriller genre that speaks to you? Why did you wind up there? Do you have any idea?
Straight ahead political books bore me, as do true crime books. And I think the reason for that is the just the facts ma'am kind of writing doesn't do anything for me. I want to know why. Why does this person think in this way? How did his background, nature or nurture or whatever it was, push him into the dastardly deeds, if you will, that some of my characters are involved with? How did they get there? And the only way I could do that was by writing fiction and by doing it, writing a mystery, because then I could figure it out. I could peel back the layers of the onion to get where I thought things would go.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly your work is realistic. It's not fantasy, even though you're writing it in a fictional sense. It is gritty and realistic. My assumption is that it's based on, in fact, I know that much of your work is based on things that have actually happened. and that you then take that and run with the ball, taking the realistic story and making it realistic fiction. That's what fascinates you. It has to be. What is it about that particular tone appeals to you? Why that tone?
Well, I don't think I have a definitive answer for that, but let's take Squinting at Shadows, which is a fictionalization of the murder of Senator Percy's daughter back in the late '60s. When I went to the Hill the first time, was then I was still in college, and I did an internship in Washington with a senator and did some writing for him. And while I was up there, I found out about the situation with Senator Percy, where his daughter was killed. I mean, it's just fascinating. They're in this big, huge house. The whole family lives in this house. This person sneaks in somehow. There was no evidence of anybody having broken in. He seems to go to just one room. He doesn't wander around the house, and there's no evidence that anything was stolen. He beats this poor girl to death. Nobody hears anything. And on his way out, he did run into the mother, who thought she heard something, and got up and was wandering around the fourth floor where all the bedrooms were, and he ran over her to get out. But that fascinated me. And then the fact that they could never solve the crime. They never figured out who killed her.
Even to this day.
No, not even today. They have no idea who did it. And he was a very well-known political character in the state of Illinois. He ran for governor. He was, CEO of Bell and Howell. So it's not like a normal person. If I'm a robber or a thug, I'm not thinking, geez, that's an ideal place to go. His Percy's house, and he's in the middle of running for the Senate. So that whole ball of wax there just fascinated me, and I decided to sit down and where could this have gone? How can I pull this apart and figure out what happened? Obviously, I fictionalized it, and it probably went in a direction that nobody ever thought of before. That's the kind of thing that fascinates me, and that's where I get my stories from. These little bits and pieces of reality that don't make any sense to me. Is that, where do I go with this?
Well, okay, so Senator Percy's story is really very much reflected in Squinting at Shadows. And it's set in Illinois, where he was from. You didn't choose to set it elsewhere. And so it kind of feels like it's that story, as you say, evolved through your thinking into a fictional story. Do you feel in any way, shape, or form that you are treading on weird ground, that you're actually making a fiction out of a real story and kept it sort of similar to what it was? You didn't change it up that much?
I didn't change up the foundation for the story itself. There at the very beginning of the story, there's the statement from the wife that gets the story started, and that statement is pretty much with some changes what she said. So the ground is hard, but I took it in a direction, and I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to spoil the story for people, but I took it in a direction that I think is realistic enough for someone to say, well, that could have happened, but is far enough from the story that I'm not disgracing Percy's reputation or anything. I don't think anybody's going to think, well, this is is this really what happened? My God, what a bastard he is.
And it's not journalism. You're not writing a story about an actual event. You're just riffing off of that underlying concept of this is a murder that happened this way. I'm fascinated always. I've been my whole life by titles. I think titles are extraordinarily important. They help guide a reader, a moviegoer, a TV watcher, whatever, toward whether this works for the story or whether it doesn't. Sometimes it sells everything. This is an interesting title you have, Squinting at Shadows. Where does that come from?
Well, I think somewhere in the novel, someone says something about squinting at shadows. That's where it came from. But what I'm saying is, I don't have a title for a novel going into the novel. It always comes from the product itself. And I don't know I can't remember at the moment where it is that it made sense for someone to say, well, if you squint at the shadows, you're going to find the truth. I do think that's the line that someone says. If you squint real hard at the shadows, you're going to find the truth. And I thought to myself at that point, oh, there's a great title, Squinting at Shadows. And that's how the titles of most of my novels go.
I think I know what that means. If you squint at shadows hard enough, you'll find the truth. I think I know what that means. What does it mean to you?
Well, it probably comes from my political background, because everything in politics is kind of hazy. Everything's very subtle. Nothing is right out there on the table.
Well, sometimes it's right out there on the table and you can't believe you're hearing it.
It depends on your perspective. Yes, of course. If you have that's the whole point. And I learned this in speechwriting. I think you never say something too terribly direct. I mean, you can go ahead and write a policy speech and say exactly what the way things should be said and lay it out A, B, C, and D. But you always leave something so that if someone comes back and says, well, what about D? And you can always say, well, that depends on C, B, and A. So what I'm saying about that is you squinting at shadows is the same way in politics. If you squint real hard, you can see around the words behind that and you can figure it out.
Because you're always with politicians trying to read between some line, correct?
Exactly. They're always squinting at shadows.
They're the ultimate subtextualists. They never say what they actually are meaning. There's always some hidden meaning behind it. 2 of the 3 books of yours that I've read feature 2 FBI agents, Eileen Prado and Ira Fisher. And I know that they appear or are featured in at least one other book, correct?
I'm trying to think. I think it's more like 4. I think it's more because the book I'm working on now, they're part of that as well. So I'm trying to think here. They're in at least 4 of them.
They're in at least 4 books. And is this one that you're writing now, is that a 5th time they'll appear, or is this the 4th time?
I think it's the 4th.
The 4th. Okay, so did you know when you've created those characters that they were likely to be, for lack of a better word, serialized, or they were going to be featured in numerous books? Did you know?
No, I didn't. It's like with most of my books, and we've discussed this before. Until I sit down and start writing, I never know where I'm going, other than having the kernel of the idea that then takes me wherever it ends up. To give you an idea, the current book I'm writing did not start with, there was nowhere necessarily that I was going to put those 2 characters. And then there was a point when some people were talking to each other, and one man says to the other, before you know it, we'll have someone in here talking about Ted Bundy. And at that point, it occurred to me, oh, okay, well, Ira Fisher's kind of a wise guy. From the background behind, the police chief is talking to these people in the background. You hear somebody say Ted Bundy, and the guy turns around, and it's those 2. It just worked its way into the conversation. And once I had Ira Fisher there, of course, I had to bring Eileen Prado into it.
Most novelists or TV series writers, most of the time when they have characters that repeat and come back and back and back, it becomes a thing. And I'm going to guess you're going to tell me this is not intended to be a thing. Is that right?
It's not intended to be a thing. It became a thing. It wasn't intended to become a thing.
Are you planning in your mind's eye? Do you think you're going to continue to use them?
I have no idea.
I find your process on this very, very interesting because it's so diametrically opposed to my process. That's why I find it interesting. And clearly it works. It works for you because you keep producing product that's out there in the world. Do you know if there's something about them that keeps attracting you back to them? Is there some quality about them?
I think so. I think that first of all, they play well against each other. Prado's more businesslike, and Ira Fisher's a little bit more a wild card. As FBI agents, I have been bringing them into situations in a metropolitan police force where they add an element of professionalism. I would say and I'm not saying that the police, metropolitan police, aren't professional, but they are super professional because they're FBI. I mean, and that's what they do. That's what they focus on. And the fact that in most of my novels, there is a psychological edge to it, and they both have worked with these kind of serial offenders before. So, the recipe is there, and I just put them into the recipe.
Well, obviously they appeal to you in some way that you go back to them. They do work off of one another very well. I will say this, I don't find them to be the typical button down FBI agents that we're used to seeing in movies and TV. They're a little looser. There's a little bit more character to them in the sense that they're not quite as straight laced as you would think of your typical FBI agents. And I'm going to guess that's probably part of what appeals to you about them.
Yes. Yeah, yes, it does.
And so, was the jumping off point on this book for you? Was it, in fact, the Charles Percy murder case? Is that what was the literal, I got to write about this? Or was there something else that got you to that?
No, it was the Charles Percy, the unsolved mystery that I've been mulling this over for ever since I was, as this intern on the Hill. The idea of this happening was just so foreign to me that something like this could happen. And I mean, they had just thousands and thousands of hours of investigation, tens of thousands of people that they talked to, and so forth and so on. And just the idea, as I've said, the whole scenario of someone getting in. By the way, the other element of this is that the daughter that was killed had a twin, and they always slept together in one bedroom. On that particular night, the twin was not there. She was off with some friends. So how did this person know this? Did he know this? Was he planning on going up there and killing the two of them? So, that whole thing was just so amazing to me that I had to do something with it.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever know or meet Senator Percy, or was that before your time?
Yes, I did. Yeah, a couple of times when I was there as an intern, I met him. He came and spoke to the group of interns, number one. And another time I was at a reception and I ran into him, and obviously I didn't talk about that, but yes, I did know him. He seemed like he did run for president. He was a very well respected member of the Senate. So I did meet him. I wasn't good buddies or anything, but I did meet him on a couple of occasions.
Mm-hmm. But you spoke his language, didn't you?
I think so. I mean, he was a more libertarian kind of conservative Republican as opposed to, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. He wasn't hard right. He wasn't a Goldwater Republican. And so yes, I guess there was that appeal.
Well, I guess when I say you spoke his language, you worked on the Hill. That's where you worked.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
So you understood that speak of what I think of as political speak that's different from the average everyday Joe's speak.
Well, yeah, and I think you have to have worked in politics to some degree, although I know one of the great political thriller writers, David Baldacci, never worked on the Hill, but he's managed to do that. But yes, I mean, I think it would be very difficult for someone to write in that genre without having spent some time on Capitol Hill.
Well, you can tell when you read your books, and this is true for all three of them, there are passages. You have action, you have things that happen between the characters and so on. But inevitably, at some point, if not multiple points in a book, you will get off into a corner where the politicians are having a political conversation of some kind. And it gets deeply, I wouldn't say deeply into the weeds, but deep enough. It gets into the weeds of politics that one can tell that you know what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, I do mind my experience to be able to do that. And I think that I hope that I don't write it so in a jargon way that people can't understand. I want them to understand what's going on, but I also want them to say, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That does bring the story and the conversation to life.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Do you think as you were writing this book, and we're going to get to your next one in a second, but did you think as you were writing this book that you were going to wind up at the conclusion, or did you not know your conclusion until you got there?
No, I did not know where I was going with it until I got there.
That's amazing. That boggles my mind, to be perfectly blunt. It just does. How long did it take to write this book?
Squinting at Shadows came rather easily. I think probably 4 or 5 months total.
4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
That's very fast. And you do this with no outline. So there's no developmental process. You're just writing it.
Well, yes and no. There's no development process in the sense of maybe what you're thinking about, an outline of characters, backgrounds, and all that sort of thing. But I did a lot of research. I read a couple of books on it. I made sure that I had the details of the crime right. And I read some books that about the case itself. So that's not including in the 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months if you put all that together.
Okay, so I'm trying to grasp how this works. If you don't know what the story is, the research you're doing is sort of the general background or the general gist of it. That's what you're researching, not anything specific in detail in the storytelling?
No, I just want to know the general background of the crime, and that's basically it. I don't read it for any other reason than that.
So as you're writing, do you have a tendency to think more about the characters and what they're thinking, or do you have more of a tendency to think about where you're going next in the plot?
It depends, I suppose, on the book itself. Some are more character driven, some are more plot driven. Most of my books, I think, are plot driven. But at the same time, if the process is lending itself to some greater character development, then I'll go in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. I think most mysteries need to be plot driven because that's what makes them a mystery. You're trying to unpeel, as you say, the onion one layer at a time to get to the ultimate answer in the story. Had you spent time in Illinois? Were you already familiar with the locations?
I haven't spent time in Illinois. I've been to Illinois, but I haven't spent a lot of time there. I spent some time in Chicago years back doing some speech writing for some people, but that was it.
So then how do you know what you're talking about in terms of locations? Because they're vivid.
Okay, well, what I'll do is I know that Kenilworth was where the crime was committed. I will then do some research on Kenilworth, specifically the area where the crime was committed. If I can find a video on sometime, for instance, there's a visit that they take to the country of Suriname in the novel itself. What I did was I found a whole bunch of videos of Suriname.
So you didn't go there and spend time there?
No, I did not. I just got hold of these videos and then double checked it with some folks that I know who had been to Suriname to make sure I was doing the right thing.
It's one of the more unique places that I can think of to write about because you don't see the name Suriname pop up too often in any kind of books or novels.
Where that came from was I was watching a travel video about Suriname, and that's what popped. That's why I got interested in that.
So when you saw this travel video, you went, wow, that's an interesting, intriguing name and place, I assume.
Yes. Plus the fact that Suriname now has some entree into the world of OPEC world because they're discovering oil there. So it made it doubly interesting to me.
The other thing that's a hallmark of your books that I've read is that you almost always, if not always, have some thoughts, conversation about morality or moral elements. That seems to be within your genre, what you're writing about. Where does that come from? Where does your moral thinking come from so that you can insert it into these characters and what they're going through?
To take one element maybe where I write about or have written about these serial offenders, these people who are just horrible people. And my interest is, and it's really frustrating because when you try and figure out how they ended up where they ended up, you really can't. I mean, you can't think like them. I think somewhere in one of my novels, I put one of the all-time hallowed profilers said, if you start thinking you can figure them out or you think you figured them out, you've got a problem. You need to go see someone because no one can think like these people.
Well, I was going to say, let's explore that a moment. I think that as you go through life, even people that have been married for 50 plus years still don't really know what their spouse is thinking or what's really in their mind's eye. We as humans don't really have the ability, I don't think, to get truly inside somebody's head all the way.
Exactly. But I think all of us realize there are limits, there are barriers that you do not cross as a civilized human person, as a moral, ethical person. Some of these people that I write about don't have that. They have no limits at all. How does that happen? And if you ask that question, you have to ask, well, if they're bad, there has to be good in order to, you can't have evil without having, good as well. So those two things, when you're writing about one or the other, either ethics, moral, or evil, you have to explore both sides of the issue.
So not to get too personal, but where does yours come from? From your parents, from your upbringing? Where does your own set of morality come from? And I don't need to know too deeply about it. I'm just curious how you have arrived at some of the thinking that you have that's in the books.
I mentioned that my dad was a foreign service officer, and we spent most of my youth overseas. Well, I was very young, but I was born in '47, so we went over to Europe in the 1950s, and then I went on to Japan and Cuba. What I'm getting at here is that I met lots of different kind of people. We were in all kinds of different circumstances. Japan after the war was a mess. People were poor. I mean, it was just atrocious, as was Germany at the time. You develop a certain empathy for the people. I mean, these things, when you're that young and you see these things, you develop I don't know exactly I guess a morality. I mean, if things are awful, you have to ask yourself, why are things awful? What's going on here? What these poor people are suffering. So I think a lot of that, plus my parents discussing, because I had a lot of questions, my parents, would answer my questions and we discussed it. I guess that's where it came from.
You have empathy for these people, and that's where I'm guessing that you saw the way that they were dealing with their struggles, and you yourself started to think about how that could be resolved or how you would deal with it, et cetera, et cetera.
You're right, exactly, and of course, I did have the background of knowing that they were on the other side of the divide, during the war. So you also start to think, well, did they put themselves in this position, or yeah? And so what I'm looking around me is all this destruction. Well, did they bring this on themselves? I mean, there's so many facets of all of that when you're exposed to it as a youngster, that's where it comes from. I think, for me anyway.
And one of the things that you've had throughout your entire life, throughout your whole career, throughout your youth and upbringing, is you've probably met many thousands of people in your life. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, yes. If you're obviously, we were talking about politics too. You meet people who are constantly talking about these issues. Now, whether they act the way you want them to act or not, but that is all, that's all part of the whole brew when you're in politics. Is which side of the line are you on?
As a writer, you have been exposed to so many humans, probably more than the average person has. You be just being on the Hill for that many years, you met so many people. So you got to see characters, you got to see the way different people thought or projected. And that to me is probably one of the most useful things you have in your toolkit as a writer.
Yeah, and one of the things, I think maybe we discussed. I did meet some quite a number of people. On the plus side, we had someone like Jackie Robinson, who I had the privilege of meeting when I was a young boy, twice actually. Once in Japan when the Dodgers came over after winning the World Series, and they did his tour of the country, and I had an opportunity to sit and talk to Jackie Robinson. He was my boyhood hero, and this was just, if I died and went to heaven the next day, that would have been amazing. And I knew about his struggles. Clearly, I wasn't just talking to a baseball player. I was talking to a man with all kinds of morals and characters. And then on the other side of the divide, I happened to have an opportunity to meet Fidel Castro. And I went with I don't know if we discussed this before.
I don't think so. Fidel Castro, that's fascinating.
Yeah, my dad was, as I mentioned, he was a Foreign Service officer. He was in the press, and he put together Castro's first press conference in Cuba. And he had him in a room, green room, and he took me down to bring Castro up to the press conference, and so I had an opportunity to meet actually, and to sit and talk to Castro. So yeah, I mean, when you start talking about that kind of stuff, it was a very golden childhood that I had. I was very fortunate, very lucky. You mentioned before I happened to meet Hemingway, so that was wonderful. And Errol Flynn, I met Errol Flynn. What a character he was. So yes. To answer your question in the long-winded way, yes, I have met a lot of people.
Yeah, that is my point, is that your exposure to huge numbers of people, I think if one decides to become a writer of fiction or nonfiction, I think that that's a big advantage. I'm saying that for the listeners to understand. If you're someone who sits around the house a lot, or you don't get out a lot, get out, because you need to meet people and be exposed to them so that you can absorb all these different cultures and thoughts and way people act and so on. And I know you're a people watcher. We talked about that the last show, and that's what this is. You've observed tons of people in your life.
Exactly. And I think all writers are probably people watchers. And I'm of the mind that most writers, other than these flamboyant characters like Hemingway and Mailer and Breslin and people like that, Erica Jung, most of us are probably the kind that sit in a room and are quiet. And that all makes it, gives you enough of a character to be able to bring things in rather than, as my dad used to say, you never learn anything with your mouth open. So
what a great phrase.
yeah, you sit and you learn by keeping your mouth shut and just watching.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Thy Brother's Keeper. Tell the listeners what that book is about, which, by the way, does not have Prado and Fisher in it.
No.
But tell the listeners what that book is about.
Well, it's about two sets of brothers. Each of the members of those sets are taken in different directions for various reasons. It's how they come back together at points in the novel. And one set is, I don't know if you'd say better than the other set, but they definitely have a different view of life and how things go than the other set. Now, interestingly enough, this was written in a totally different way than Squinting at Shadows. Thy Brother's Keeper came from two short stories that I had written years ago. And people would read the short stories and they'd say, well, what happened to those people? And that's what I did. I took the short stories and combined them and made a novel out of it.
And so that this was something that had been gestating in your mind's eye for quite some time then.
Yeah, and it's total fiction. Usually I have there is a small element of truth to it, but I usually have a foundation of truth to build on. In this particular instance, it was just, it's total fiction.
And now that you've done that, do you have a preference between writing based on something that actually happened as opposed to making it all up?
Not really. I will take whatever muse I have, whatever's stuck in my head and I need to get out, I will take it in the direction that it goes. I think perhaps having a foundation of true whatever, reality based, is easier because you have a base to work with. When you are sitting down and using your total imagination, that's a little more challenging.
Yeah, I would say it's actually a lot more challenging. I've always found it a little easier when you have something you're adapting that already exists, or you're actually taking a real story and making it come to life. I think that's what you're talking about. It's much harder to come up with something out of nothing. Good on you for doing that. What was the inspiration to get you to write this story?
Well, in one instance, you'll recall that the younger brother is sitting waiting for his older brother to come through town. He's being transported through town by some police because he's being transported to jail through the town that he grew up in. And the younger brother is waiting for him to come through. And the story is set to, you don't really know how the younger brother is going to react, what he's going to do. And that is just something, again, I think I must have either read something or the story just popped in my mind. You have this small town. What would happen if we had this situation? It was actually, when I first started thinking about it, it was a Native American story of a Native American boy who thinks that his brother was unfairly judged, and he's been brought through town, and is he going to do something with his friends to free his brother to get his? That just seemed too complicated. Too many people going to get hurt. It'd be impossible to do. So I wrote the story in another way, and that is this young brother who is not happy with his brother because his brother has killed his parents. And that's the whole basis for that particular element of the story, of that.
And we learned that right at the top. So you're not really giving anything away here.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's giving anything. I think the real gestation of the story is in how they come back together.
That for sure. That's the big part of the story, is how they come back together.
Yeah. And then the other part of it was I had this story that I had in my mind forever about young two brothers meandering around in a forest an ation near their house that is forested, and they come upon, as you remember from the book, they come upon a hut. They come upon an old guy that lives there, and it's how they interact. It's kind of a coming of age story, and that because there are two brothers in both of those stories. That's what I jumped. That was the jumping off point for my novel, for my that particular novel.
And certainly focused on troubled, difficult children who grow up into very, very interesting and different adults. And I think that that's fascinating to watch what happens to them, at least the way that you lay it out. Now, you set this book in Owen, Oklahoma. Why Owen, Oklahoma, of all places? Had you been there? Is it something you're familiar with?
My wife and I traveled through Oklahoma a couple of years ago. It's an interesting state. There is no Owen, Oklahoma. That's a fictional town. But I also have a very good friend of mine who I worked with in Washington, who was from Oklahoma and used to tell me stories about the Okies. He grew up very very poor, and he used to tell me stories about the Okies and his growing up, his background, and how he grew up, which is reflected in the set of brothers that begin the novel. And that's where that came from.
The notion of Oklahoma came from this friend in Washington, and so Owen is a fictional town, but is it based on a real place?
Well, this friend of mine was from a small town in Oklahoma that he told me a lot about. So I suppose it's based on that. I didn't sit down with that in my mind to do it that way. But when you look back and ask and answer questions like yours, it brings up to mind that that was probably why became Owen, Oklahoma.
So a famous author who people almost never talk about anymore, James Michener, was famous for writing big epic stories, whether during wars or during a hurricane in Hawaii is a famous story of his. He was very well known for going and living in a place for a very long period of time, a year or more, in order to absorb the culture and the people and the locations. This is not your way to operate at all, is it?
No. And I suppose it's cheating a little bit because I do probably add elements or don't have the elements in there that make it truly real. But I don't think you necessarily need to, because these are stories about people, and you find these people and their stories anywhere. You wouldn't necessarily have to go live in Oklahoma to tell this story, in my view, anyway.
So, does anybody ever bust you on that? Does anybody ever say, I'm from there, and you've got that all wrong? No,
exactly the opposite. I've gotten people from Oklahoma have said, "Oh my God, how did you capture that? Did you spend time in Oklahoma?" So, no is the answer, and it's just the opposite for whatever reason.
I think I'm going to guess again that your youth of traveling around as much as you did gave you a sense of being able to quickly absorb a different culture.
Probably because, as I mentioned just at the beginning of this session here, I went to 8 schools in 8 years, and you learn to adapt. You learn to pick up elements. In order to get along, you have to go along. So you have to, as a kid especially, you have to, what's important here, and how do these people work, and how do I make sure I don't get beat up every day in school. So yeah, there's that's probably has a lot to do with it.
And going back to the idea of brothers sort of in conflict or trying to figure one another out, it's one of the oldest stories we have. It's a biblical story. It's Cain and Abel. And this has been around for, obviously, for centuries. The question that I have is, why do you think that is, that stories like brothers at odds with one another? We had brothers against one another in the Civil War, and that within a family, that you can get stories of people who are at these terrible loggerheads and have to figure out how to live together anyway. Where does this come from in our world, do you think?
Every family that I've come in touch with seems to have that sort of element in their family. There's always the black sheep. I'm being very general here. I'm sure there are families where everybody gets along famously and they loves each other, but I'd be hard pressed. Even my own family, there's elements of that. I'm not saying that anything terrible happened, but there was, there are just sibling rivalries, and if you're a writer and you take a sibling rivalry and you take it to the extremes, because that's the drama of the book you're working in. But I think it's human. I don't think it has so much to do with family. I think it's probably more noticeable. It's taken to a greater level when it's within a family. But I think it's very human. You put people together in a room. You might have some conflicts. But I'm not sure it's just because it's a family.
Well, it's also generational. Somebody's older, somebody's younger, so they're from slightly different, times. Their friends are different, and so on. It's all those things that happen between humans, and so that's really what I think you're digging into there. Now, the two of the brothers, Declan and Connor Ryan, you at one point you finally reveal. It takes a while to get there, but you finally reveal Declan is dealing with his own sexuality, and he's dealt with it for his whole life, basically, and he's a cop, so I assume that that's part of what keeps him from outwardly dealing with his own sexuality. But I'm wondering what caused you to inject that into the story at the point that you went, aha, there's something I want to make sure we cover. What caused you to want to cover that at that time?
Well, I know this frustrates you as a different writer with a totally different process, but I keep having to go back to it. I don't.
It
Yeah,
just happens.
it just happens. I don't. I remember the only thing I can say about that is that they were talking about Connor's experiences in prison. And it's quite possible
Mm-hmm.
that Declan just wanted to, at that point, he said, I've never told him. I have to tell him. He's talking to me about some difficulties he had in prison. It just made sense at that point. He's probably been fighting with himself for not mentioning this to his brother for all these years. That it was something maybe that caused them problems when they were younger because one was probably their personalities clashed. So this just seemed like the point in the novel where it made sense to bring it out. Now, why I drew a gay character in the novel, it just seemed like an element of his personality that would make him more interesting, especially being a cop, as you mentioned.
So let's break this apart just a half a step. Once you have for lack of a better word, an epiphany, you go, we're going to go down this road. And you had not thought of it before. Obviously, you're not planning it out. And now you have a choice as the author. I have an idea. This is something that's kind of interesting. You have a choice. You can go down that road or you cannot go down that road. You can go down a different road. But you chose to go down that road. So something appealed to you at that moment to say, I want to explore this notion of this character. Do you have a recognition of that happening for you, or are you just plowing ahead?
Yes and no. I'm plowing ahead, but at the same time, Declan is in my view, is a very moral, ethical person. He did not want to let this moment go by without mentioning it to his brother. I think he thought this would help us, with the problems that we've had in the past. This might bring us closer together. I'm trusting him with this very sensitive information. But then in a broader picture, it adds to his character. He's a policeman, but to him, his sexuality is very incidental, and it's not something that's dwelled on in the novel, other than to discuss it with his brother. And you'll remember later on, one of the other brothers brings it up to him, saying that I have a feeling that your sexuality is an issue here, or I could make it an issue here. And Declan dismisses him and says, do what you want. I don't care. I've he doesn't even admit this is true. He just says, I'm just not going to deal with it. And that's the kind of person he is. That's who I am. Deal with it.
Once he has sort of revealed himself to Connor, I think that he then has a sense of freedom about it because he'd been bottled it up for a long time.
Right. And I think once he's had that conversation with the with the other politician who happens to be the brother, he's more or less dismissed it himself. I'm not going to go there. You can go there if you want, but I'm not going to go there, and I'm not going to compromise my own values for this situation.
Did this book also take you roughly 4 months to write?
This one took a little longer because, as I said, I didn't have the foundation.
It was an original story, yeah.
Yeah, so it probably, well, not probably, it did. It took at least 6 months, maybe into 7.
All right, so I know from our last conversation that you talked about that you are a reviser, a rewriter. It's not first draft and that's it. There are multiple drafts and revisions.
Well, especially with the process that I use, if you're just plowing ahead and writing, you get to the end, you realize, well, gee, all of these things that I got to in the end, I've got to go back and make sure that everything makes sense, because at the time that I'm writing at the beginning, since I don't know what the end is, it could conflict with what I'm doing at the end. So there's a lot of rewriting.
One of the trainings that I got as a writer in school was that you can purge a draft out, and then you are inevitably going to go back to the beginning to make everything work as a unified whole. I guess now what am curious about is how fast is your first draft versus how long do you revise?
First draft usually comes fairly easily, maybe a month, 6 weeks, sometimes 2 months. Then the rewrite takes at least as long, probably maybe a month longer than the original.
I'm going to also once again say that as a longtime professional writer of nonfiction, although some people would say what comes out of Washington is often fiction, but that's another story. As a longtime writer, you know how to crank words out. If that's not a foreign thing to you.
No, it's it's just something that comes naturally because of who I am, I guess, and my experience and background.
Did it always come easily to you, even in the beginning of your being a writer?
No. You're talking about like when I was in college and when I was afterwards starting speechwriting and all that. No, I agonized over every word, but I learned that didn't help. That's where I think I learned my process, because I used to agonize over every word, and I just didn't have time. When you're cranking out speeches, you just cranked it out. And then whatever time was left, you went back and you cleaned things up.
In doing that over time, did anyone ever say to you, "This is junk. Why are you writing this?" Or you got so good at it that nobody knew that you were just cranking it out?
I have to say, no one ever said you're just cranking out junk. So I guess what I was doing made sense to everybody.
Well, I guess the reason why I even asked the question is because you just said you got to the point where you realized agonizing over every word was pointless. That means that you were then practicing the craft of writing as quickly as you could. In my world, for me personally, if I know that the faster I write, I know the more mistakes I'm making. I just know that. And if I at least spend the time coming back, and if I'm not very careful as I'm writing, I've got to spend a lot of time revising. I'm a reviser too. So you spend more time then really rewriting than you do writing. I think that that's important for people to understand. All right, you're very good at creating tone in a story. We've already alluded to tone once in this conversation. Do you have a sense of what it is that allows you to capture tone of a story?
I think for me, what sets the tone is my dialogue. And because a lot of my novels, I think, are just almost exclusively dialogue, although I try to set the scene in which the characters have their conversations. A few minutes ago discussed it. I think it's because I can sit back and I can listen to people and pick up, I guess, the way they're talking, how they're talking, when their tone changes, how different people, again, through 35 years of meeting so many different people and having to get along with people when I was younger just to survive. I think all those elements went into the fact that I can write dialogue, and that for me helps set the tone of a novel.
I think that that's a very good self-analysis. I think that's exactly what it is that you understand how people are. And by being able to do that, you inevitably get to the tone of every scene as what it is, and the tone of the whole book, because that's what it is. It's people interacting with one another. It's people in conflict with one another. That's what we're interested in anyway. Well, I've been having just a fantastic second conversation with J. David Bethel. We're going to wind the show down just a little bit. As we've been saying, you've met and dealt with huge numbers of people over your career and your life. Are you able to share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny from all of your experiences?
Well, earlier in this conversation, we were talking about some of the people I met. One of them being Errol Flynn, and when we were living in Cuba, there was a restaurant bar in Old Havana called Bodeguita del Medio. Everybody went there, and my dad, being in the press part of the operation of the United States Embassy, used to come in contact with people like Errol Flynn all the time. Every time they came to town, they got in touch with him because he was the one that they came to town for a reason. Well, most of the time for a reason. They were there to promote a book, and he was at Bodeguita del Medio when I was having my 12th birthday, and he knew my father, and my father knew him, and he came over to the table, and he was talking to us, and of course my sister and I, young, 12, and she was 11, we thought of him and knew of him as Robin Hood, and movies like that, Captain Blood, and all that sort of stuff. So as he was walking away from the table, my sister looks over at my father and she says, "Boy, Robin Hood got fat." There's another story about Errol Flynn. We got a call about 3 a.m. I was waking up by it. I didn't know what was going on, but it was unusual for these calls to come to the house because of the reasons I mentioned of what my father did. And my father disappears, and he's gone. He comes back the next morning, and he was at the breakfast table with us. And my mom's, what the hell happened? So my dad said, "Well, Errol called me, and what happened was he was in a hotel room there, and the police. I guess he was being loud, whatever. He was having a party, and they rapped on his door, and so he said, 'Paul, you got to come downtown and get me out of this.' So my dad gets dressed, goes downtown, goes to the hotel. He's walking up to the door of the hotel, and he sees Errol Flynn in a bathrobe on his hands and knees, rooting through the grass of the hotel. He walks over. He says, 'Errol, what the hell are you doing?' He says, 'Well, when the cops came, I had to throw all my drugs out the window.' So he says, 'I've got to find them. I got to find my drugs.'"
Oh my God.
So this is the kind of stuff I grew up with.
You were dealing with the real Errol Flynn, not the fictional Errol Flynn, right?
Oh no, the real Errol Flynn, the guy.
That's amazing. And, it's still true to this day. Movie stars, famous people, they're just people. They have all their quirks and foibles that everyone else has. But they're famous, so they can't get away with certain things easily.
No, and and again, this is maybe I bring this perspective to my novels too. That you try and paint people as opposed to the ideals that you have in your mind of these people.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. I think you're very realistic in your writing. Your people are very well drawn. We talked about in the first show that we did that you're very good at drawing realistic people, and I think that holds true in the two books that I've read recently. All right. So, last question for you today, David. Can you share with us a piece of advice that you think is useful or helpful for people who are just getting into the business of being a novelist?
Someone once gave me this advice, and they said, "If you're a writer, you write." Now, what that means is that you don't write because you have this ideal that you're going to write the great American novel, or that you're going to, be on the New York Times bestseller list. You're going to sell your story to the movies or television and make wads of money. Just go ahead and write because you like to write. Because chances are you're not going to write the great American novel. You'll be lucky to get a book published. If it gets published, you'll be lucky if 10 people read it. So make sure that you know what you're doing and you're getting into writing for the right reasons, and that is because you enjoy writing.
I think that's about as good a piece of advice as you can give to people that want to be writers. Writers must write. It's just that simple. No one can give it to you. You have to do it yourself. And the only way to get good at it is to just keep writing. Do you feel like you have gotten stronger as a writer the more you've written?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I used to get to a point when I first started writing in a novel and question, well, what comes next? How do I do this? Where do I go with this? And now I don't even bother with that. I just keep going and keep writing. I've learned not, as I said before, not to agonize over every word. Just keep on going, keep on typing.
You've learned to trust your own instincts quite well.
I try to.
Well, evidently you must, because that's how you do it, which I think is fantastic. J. David Bethel, thank you so much for being on the show with me for the second time. And, if anyone wants to check it out, check out Squinting at Shadows and Thy Neighbor's Brother and all of J. David Bethel's books. Thank you so much for being on the show with me, David.
Thanks for having me.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.